Hello, Miss Joanie.
Hey,
and
Miss Deborah.
Yes, this is the Folktales part of our summer reading program. And today we're going to talk about the difference between folk tales and fairy tales.
Okay, well, I think we should talk about folk tales first. Let's talk about folk tales. Folk tales are old stories that were passed down orally, generation to generation. They just talked and told the story, and talked and told the story. And these are timeless stories that would change a little bit with each telling. And eventually they got written down, some of them, most of them. But originally these are oral stories. And each story is very basic in one way, beginning, middle, and end. And they have characters. And the characters are either people or animals that talk, or characters, or maybe like ogres, or witches, or queens and kings, depending on the type of folk tale that it is. Each story will have a setting where the story took place, when the story took place. And a story can have more than one setting. And each story will have a problem, and that's the conflict between the characters, or some situation that just has to be resolved. That moves the story forward, and then the story finds a solution, and then all folk stories have some sort of lesson, or moral, or something like that. Right? So that's the big umbrella of folk stories. Under the umbrella of folk stories, there are different kinds of folk stories. There are trickster stories like Brer Rabbit and Anansi. There are legends. There are tall tales. There are myths. There are all sorts of stories, and one type of story, one type of folk tale are fairy tales. And so, fairy tales have some things in common that put them in this group. The fairy tales that we are most familiar with are those out of Europe, but those are not the only fairy tales. There are, of course, fairy tales out of every country and continent, but we are familiar with stories that are fairy tales from Europe. So when we hear a story that begins, once upon a time, a long time ago in a land far away, there once lived. You know that a fairy tale, you know intrinsically that a fairy tale is getting ready to happen, because we've said it in the past, and we know we're going to tell a story about something that has happened someplace magical. That's the other part of a fairy tale. Magical things happen. It's make-believe. These aren't real stories. These are made-up, make-believe stories. And then, interesting thing about the characters in a fairy tale, they'll often occur in groups of 3 or 7, right? Goldilocks and the 3 bears. The 3 little pigs. Snow White and the 7 dwarfs. So you'll often see that. And the characters in fairy tales are either good or bad. There's no nuance, no gray area. They are the good guys or the bad guys. She's the princess or she's the evil queen. There's not a lot of fluidity between good and bad. There will be a problem, like in all folk tales, and a solution. And sometimes, particularly with fairy tales, the solution might be magical, like Cinderella and her fairy godmother. It's a fairy godmother that helps with the problems of, I don't have anything to wear, I want to go to the ball, I can't get there, she takes care of all of that. And the solution is how you resolve the conflict or the problem. For fairy tales, all endings are going to be happy. You're going to hear an ending that sounds like, and they lived happily ever after the end. Or, and the wolf was never seen again, the end. the solution to the problem always results in a happy ending for a fairy tale. And so it's not so much that there's a difference between fairy tales and folk tales, but fairy tales are part of the folk tale genre.
Wow, very nice. And this will be excellent for any teacher this summer that wants to participate in our folk tales and folk trails to do maybe like a lesson plan on that.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Thank you, Miss Jo.
Thank you, Miss Deborah. Thank you for having me.
Mhm.